All right, thanks for tuning into another episode of Bitcoin versus the banks. This is one that I believe my father-in-law is going to be into because he's a hockey nut, and I'm joined here by Chris Johnston. He is a hockey analyst for TSN Canada. How's it going, Chris?
I'm doing great. It's so cool to be on a Bitcoin podcast for me because I'm a listener first and foremost, and so it's kind of fun to jump in front of the mic and hack it around with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and this is pretty cool for me. I mean, you're a guy that at least Canadians would recognize you. I'm not so much maybe the Americans or foreigners. I don't know. I guess it depends on just how into hockey you are. But yeah, you're somebody that I've kind of grown up seeing on TV, and getting any sort of analysis from you has always been really cool. So to kind of like get into your brain and talk Bitcoin is just that much cooler. So yeah, we're definitely going to get into Bitcoin. I also want to kind of like talk a little bit about player contracts and sort of the money they make because I think there's a lot of, I want to call them misconceptions, but like there's a lot of animosity towards professional athletes. You're probably well aware. Um, I probably felt this way many years ago when the players had a lockout back in. You probably know the year better than I do. It was quite a while ago. But you know, the concern among people was that players make too much money, and us plebs who don't make as much, like we feel bad about it. So what is it that people are kind of missing? Like what don't they understand in that like players make money for a reason. They make millions of dollars, a lot of money. There's a good reason why they do so. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, anyone who's attended a game and sees the ticket cost, especially if you're in, one of the Canadian markets, a place where the sport is most popular, really they're earning a fraction of what the business itself is bringing in. They have that value to the person who ultimately signs the checks. And, I think if you dig a little deeper, we're talking about a very small percentage of achievement essentially in the world. I mean, the amount of players that play any given sport, but since hockey's my main one, you know, they get siphoned down to a smaller and smaller number the whole way along. And really the number that reached the NHL and can play on the ice surface where someone would pay 500 or 600 or $700 to go to a game. I mean, they've put a lot of their own time and effort into it. I mean, we're talking about high end achievers. And I think if you look at the top end of most industries, it might not be the exact kind of dollars you're talking about with a professional athlete earning, but certainly, I do think that they've sort of, in a sense, earned a claim to that. And, finally, their careers are so short. And so I think what we see, like what you see on a news site or on X, or if you see this player signed for this much, I mean, you really have to understand that when between taxes and agents' fees, the cost of living, the fact that they tend to live between multiple cities at a time. Obviously, they can afford multiple houses, but still, there's a pretty high cost to living that kind of life. And then their career's over at 31, and in a lot of cases, without a lot of real avenues to other employment that they could ever hope to earn those sort of dollars. I mean, I think that it's a very unique career. The closer I've got to it, and the more I've gotten to know athletes, and obviously become friends with some of these guys, more beyond their playing days, it's not all it's cracked up to be. I'll say that. I mean, clearly, if we're talking about Connor McDavid or Sidney Crosby or the sort of players that anyone, whether you're a fan or not, have heard of course, they make many hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's a different case. But the average player, it's not on the surface what it looks like, and I think that they face a lot of financial challenges, that they have to navigate, and they're young too, right? Players coming into the league at 18, 19, 20. I mean, I think of myself at that age. I was certainly making financial decisions, but they didn't carry the kind of weight that these guys face.
Yeah, really well said. Like the way I think about it, or have come to think about it anyways, is that, it's all of our eyeballs are on that screen for a reason, right? We're there to see those particular individuals. And so the revenue that these leagues generate, I mean, it wouldn't be there without those guys. And to say, just flat out, they make too much, it's not really looking at the whole picture as far as I'm concerned. It's like these guys make, whatever the fraction is of the overall revenue, and if that league happens to make, X number of billions of dollars, well, I feel like they're entitled to that. And there's a reason why when you look at player contracts, the top echelon players in the NHL, unfortunately, make far less than they would in, let's say, the NBA, because, well, at the end of the day, there's more eyeballs looking at the NBA, right?
Yeah. exactly. And to me, it's the ultimate actually proof of work job because if an athlete doesn't perform by whatever the measurables are, whether it's goals, assists, their teams are looking at things under the hood that maybe aren't as publicly available to you and I. But if they're not performing to those levels, I mean these guys don't get continued employment. It's the opposite of kind of what I heard of the generation before ours. That some people hope to work in one place for 30 or 40 years and get a pension and all that sort of thing. I mean, even a pension isn't guaranteed to a player. They only get a percentage of how many years they spend in the league. So, if you're not up to standard, you're cast away pretty cruelly. Sometimes, if you run into injuries, I mean, NHL player contracts are guaranteed in the sense that if you have a 3-year term and you get injured, that 3 years is guaranteed, but you can't perform beyond that. I mean, unless you've taken out subsequent insurance or something, you're not getting paid, and you could be done at 24 or 25. I mean, it happens every year, unfortunately. And so, I do think that there's more risk in that profession too than the typical job out there. And so it really is. It's hard to compare it to what most of us do day to day because I just think it is so unique and so different. And as you mentioned, if my boss was making $7 billion a year, well, then I'd be making a lot more money than I am today.
Right. I guess I haven't really thought about that. Like if I'm a player that entering the league and I'm say 18 years of age, maybe I'm in the league for a year or two, and I do get this sort of career-ending injury. I mean, what options are there for these guys beyond, let's say, getting into coaching? Is there much beyond that?
There's certainly programs. I know the NHL Players Association tries to provide educational resources and other things in terms of mapping out a totally separate career. I think if in the hypothetical you've raised here, if you're 23 years old, I mean, there certainly would be an opportunity to pursue education or other things. I mean, there would be avenues, but probably the hardest part would be is where do you start if you don't have something else you've wanted to do? I mean, most players don't make it to the NHL by accident, right? Their whole life has been sleeping and eating, hockey, training, putting other things aside in their life, maybe not even attending school to the degree that they might have, not because they don't have the intelligence to, but because they were so focused on it. And you get to that point, and you're doing it, and you've almost never imagined what the second lane would be, especially if you're young. I think, one of the things that's great for the players that have a long career, 15, 18 years, I think a lot of those guys, in my experience, they tend to start they see that they're getting towards the back nine. They know that the end is coming. If they've been there long enough, they've seen other teammates go through it over the years. I think sometimes those players can start in the summer times, planning out where they'll go. But when your career ends up abruptly, a lot of players struggle with that. And we don't have to look hard to find tragic stories, even, players that have fallen into drugs and alcohol or gone bankrupt, had a lot of interpersonal issues. I mean, I think that it's a real danger if you lose your passion and you don't know where else to channel that energy or that time. It can be very difficult. And this is why I say I think seeing it up close for as long as I have, I view it totally differently. I mean, when I was a kid, believe it or not, Milan, I wanted to do this job since I was 5 years old. I can't even
That's awesome.
explain where that impulse came from or what the draw was. I mean, obviously I loved hockey and I was sort of almost as a kid, I'm very obsessive about learning the statistics and watching the games. And I really loved following the league. But I saw it almost, I obviously idolized those players as a kid. I didn't have an adult's perspective on it, but now, 20 years into my career, I can look at it and say, it's definitely not always what it's cracked up to be. There's a lot of difficult realities of the business. And I do feel a lot of empathy for the fact that, of course, some of these players are wildly rich beyond any of my dreams, but I think a lot of them do face difficult moments that aren't seen in the public or aren't portrayed enough, by people like me whose job it is to tell their stories.
And I think what ends up happening over time is these people get sort of dehumanized. We put them on a pedestal. We think about the money they make, and that's sort of it, right? It just on a surface level. And I like the fact that you get an opportunity to actually get to really know these guys. And it's kind of a shame that the public doesn't see more of their true character, if you will. I mean, if one day we can kind of make that happen, really shed light on their personalities, I think that would be great for them, obviously, but even for the leagues. I think maybe the NBA is doing that a little bit. I don't know. I kind of lost touch with it. I used to be a huge basketball fan, but the game has changed in such a way that I don't find it quite as interesting anymore. Whereas the NHL I actually enjoy more and more, and I would love to see just more of. Doesn't even have to be the stars. The younger, maybe less skilled guys on the team, just getting to know who they are. I think would make it just more interesting, right? Getting that sort of kind of narrative piece in there, if you will. Um, Forget where I was going with that, so I apologize. But one thing that I'm really curious about is like when a player is, let's say, at the end of a contract, how much of their decision of re-signing or moving to another team, how much of it is actually driven by money? And
I think
obviously,
the fair
it's going to vary player to player, but just sort of generally speaking.
right. I mean, we were talking about a player pool of 800 to 900 players in any given year that play in the league on a regular basis, and I think generally it's pretty significant. For kind of the reasons I've outlined, I think a lot of players, or at least their agents, their parents, influential people in their decision making processes, understand that their careers are finite, even more than the average person. That the need to maximize your earning potential is of utmost importance. And so I do think that drives a lot of decision making. Now, for certain individuals, who might have unique circumstances, or maybe are at the very high end of the league, lifestyle, city, where their families, might prefer to live, where they grew up. Some of those situations come into play. But, that's a pretty small number of players, because the way the rules work is you have to be 7 years into the NHL, essentially, before you can become what's known as an unrestricted free agent, before you have freedom to choose where you play. And you could test a true open market. I mean, before that point, your rights are controlled by a team that drafts you and then who may trade for you in those intervening 7 years. But it takes a long time to get to the point where you could even call your shot. And so I think, given that they play under the parameters of the system, again, by and large, where each individual player doesn't have a whole lot of ability to dictate where he's going to call home for his job, I think, of course, in that circumstance, you're going to want to maximize what you earn as well, because you can also sign for this amount of money with this team, and unless you get what's called a no trade clause in your contract, a team can also trade you. So, I think that's one thing you have to consider, because the NHL is 32 teams spread across North America, obviously different tax jurisdictions. We're talking about 2 different countries, obviously many states and provinces. You could sign a contract for a team in Florida where there's no personal income tax applied, but in the life and maybe you're inclined to take a little bit less because of that, but you could be traded to California-based team in the life of that contract, and all of a sudden be subject to a lot higher tax rate. And so I think that is probably the most important factor for the average player. If we're going to group, sort of come up with this idea of what mostly drives decisions, I do think that the first thing that they're worried about is that dollar figure on the contract.
Yeah, and I mean, no reason to fault somebody for basing their decision on money. I often say money rules the world. It's interesting you brought up the tax issue, because I've thought about that a lot. Like, players are incentivized to go to places like Florida because at the end of the day, a $5 million contract is going to sort of pay way more ultimately if you're in Florida as opposed to a New York or a California. Do you ever see that maybe changing sometime down the road, where the contract actually, I guess the dollar figure actually is different depending on the state in which you're playing? Could that happen?
I think it could happen. I know that there's been at least high level discussion about it. I don't think we've ever got to the point where it was close to being implemented. But some teams have an issue with this, and I can understand it. I mean, when we're talking about the NHL specifically, they have a hard salary cap. There's a fixed amount that every team can spend on player contracts. And, you can look at a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning based in Florida that have had a whole bunch of success for the last 10 or 15 years. And they've been successful in part because they've kept their star players at numbers below what commiserate players around the league have earned, and that obviously brings an advantage. It leaves more money for them to spend elsewhere in the roster and help the team stay competitive. I personally think that every team has pros and cons. I mean, some other teams may not have that tax advantage, but they might have different facilities, or they might be able to attract players. I mean, I think you got to accentuate the good here, but certainly some teams have noted, especially those in Canada, that isn't necessarily a fair system. And so I don't know if we'll get to the day where the league goes that far, but when you're playing under a fixed salary cap, to me, it would make sense to try to normalize in some manner. Now, I will be the first to put my hand up and say I do not have the ability to explain how that might work, because I think it's beyond my reach. But I think conceptually, from 10,000 feet, it would make sense to go to that. It would just be a matter of, in collective bargaining, is it an issue that gains enough traction to get written into the rules of the league.
I'm glad that that's I guess on the table that people are having that discussion. Um, and in a way, it's not that surprising. And I say that because I know the NHL is like really keen on having parity within the league. I think other leagues maybe don't care about it as much as the NHL does. Yeah, that's really cool, and I actually find that quite fascinating. One thing that like really interests me is like what happened with COVID, specifically the lockdowns, right? Every time you saw a league shut down, whether NHL, NBA, NFL, it was like, wow, like this is a big thing. And obviously there were huge implications in various ways, but we know it affected players, it affected staff members, people working in stadiums. So I'm curious, like what happened to, let's start with contracts. What happened to player contracts over that time?
So essentially, NHL players are played just during the balance of the regular season. And the regular season, for those that don't follow the league closely, runs roughly from the beginning of October until mid-April. And so if you remember, we're talking about lockdowns that started close to mid-March of 2020. And so I don't have the exact number, but somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% of the season had been played. And so players, by and large, at that point had been paid what they were going to be paid for that season. And this created a unique problem for the NHL because the way the league system works is that players as a whole get 50% of the revenues that the league brings in that calendar year. And obviously, stopping your business midway through the year, as many businesses learned across all industries in that period of time, creates a situation where basically there's no money coming to the door. And so they made what was a short-term arrangement. Well, in fact, they basically extended the collective bargaining agreement they had with something called a memorandum of understanding. And what they did is they basically stopped saying that 50%, that players get 50%. And so the players' contracts were still paid out to that point, but all of a sudden the players as a whole ended up taking more than 50% of the revenue that season because their owners stopped bringing money in. And so what we've had in all these years since, effectively, the players as a whole have been paying back that amount of money. And that's what the new system that was brought in really just because of COVID and was designed to do. And so the salary cap itself has only taken small bumps by $1 million a year. So there's not a lot of new money, I would call, coming into the system. But the players have basically had a collective debt to the owners to repay the money they took during those COVID years, because even the subsequent season, the 2020-21 season, in Canada, most of those games were played with no fans in the stands because of the different
Right.
rules that were, in place up here where we live. But, in the States, some teams could generate revenue that season, but, safe to say the players took more than their share of the pie that year too. And so in a strange way, so at times in this sports history, the players and owners collectively have kind of butted heads. But I think that the unique circumstances of that pandemic required them to work together, maybe to a degree that I haven't seen in previously in my years covering the NHL. And it's only just now that debt is about to be, levied up and the league can start to grow again. So essentially, it's almost, even all these years after COVID, it's almost still been in a position where, players aren't earning more. It was just about getting through that rough period. And really starting next summer is the first big jump we're expecting the salary cap tied to revenues growing at a normal rate again.
Sorry, you said next year?
Yeah, next summer.
And prior to all of this COVID stuff, what was the average increase in the salary cap? Was it like a certain dollar amount or percentage?
It typically would land somewhere at 3 to 5% per year. And in the early days, when they brought the salary cap in back in 2004-05, and they set it rather low. It started at 39.5 million because the revenues at that time were growing quite substantially. It was taking larger jumps initially. And then probably I'd say in the 2017, 18, 19, 20, like leading up to the COVID year, you could count on somewhere between a 3 and a 5% bump. And it's going to be set now at 83.5 million for this coming season. It's expected to jump a full 5% next summer, so somewhere around 88, give or take, and then probably a full 5% the year after that. So it'll be jump up over 90 million pretty quickly. So it's been stalled, and that has an effect on the system as a whole because there just isn't money. A lot of players are getting squeezed out, essentially. The top players, I think that there's a case to be made, have still largely done well, but some of maybe the middle class, I think, have been squeezed. And you have a system where you have players earning the league minimum and a lot of players earning at the top end, but maybe not as much money in the middle for players that fall between those two extremes.
And does that affect new players in any way, or do they just kind of come into the league and it's just everything just seems normal for them?
It probably seems normal for them, because they don't know any different. And I mean, look, this would be a good time to be a new player coming into the league because with those big jumps expected, I think that we're going to see all player salaries trend upwards again. I mean, it just kind of logically makes sense. And so, what's kind of become an interesting dynamic, I would say, even for the top players, even this summer that has just finished, it's always discussed. Okay, if I sign a long-term contract, well, this is going to come into effect when the salary cap is jumping again. And I think that that's been a big projection that's happened in those negotiations between the players and the teams. Well, how much is it? And how much is maybe a player potentially leaving on the table if he signs a long-term deal now? And so this has been a big part of, I'd say, the behind-the-scenes discussion around the league. This summer in particular, with we've had some high-profile players like Austin Matthews sign a long-term deal in Toronto, and some guys actually didn't sign this summer, and I think partially it's just because they want to see for certain, what's going to happen next year. Because, what I'm telling you now is based on projections, but as we get into March and April and May, it'll be clear one way or another if that's going to happen or not.
When is that decision finalized? Is it in May?
It's actually not until right before free agency is on July 1st. It's usually finalized 100% somewhere around June 20th. But, once, because you're setting it based on the current season, the deeper into that season, I think the league can have more confidence that they're going to hit certain thresholds or targets. And so the closer you get to July 1st, I think the more accurate the predictions can become. But it's not actually finalized, the number, until just days before free agency.
Okay. Do you know if the number of people that are attending games is it back to what it was like prior to COVID?
Yeah, and it's actually above because they've added a team in Seattle here 2 years ago, and so having an extra team in the mix has actually allowed them to increase overall attendance. But I think by and large, I mean, there might be some individual markets probably more tied to the team's performance
Right.
where attendance didn't rebound. But by and large, I think as a league, the experience has been that everything actually returned to sort of business as usual post pandemic in terms of TV numbers, attendance, what gets purchased when it comes to sweaters and other things that help drive revenue. I mean, the league has bounced back probably better than any of us could have guessed, because I do remember those days. I almost existential if you're me, and my career has been in covering the NHL. It was the first time I ever had to imagine, like, what happens if there's no NHL? I mean, it sounds almost silly now, 3 years on, 3+ years on, but in the moment, it just wasn't clear what was going to happen with coronavirus, if we were going to be able to gather en masse again, which is obviously vital to that business and many others. And, I think given how dire it felt, there's a lot of satisfaction at the league level that things have rebounded to a reasonable rate and that they're actually going to start growing now.
It's good to hear. And yeah, it's good to see people out and about and just watching sports again. So, in the Bitcoin space, obviously there's this common saying that money's broken. I'm wondering, like with you being an analyst and having such insight into the league, can you see instances of that notion sort of applying to the NHL?
I can.
Okay.
And look, this is through my own lens, and I'm speaking to you as a Bitcoiner and someone
Yep.
who views the world that way. I mean, there would certainly be people within the NHL, and I'm just putting this caveat on my answer, who probably say, well, I'm crazy, and that what I'm about to say doesn't, I'm the one who's off, not them. But where I see money being broken is the same way I do really in the society that's around me today. I see inflation at a crazy rate. And in this case, money being broken probably is trends towards the favor of those who own NHL teams, because we're seeing the valuations of those teams skyrocket. I mean, levels we could never imagine. And it sort of makes sense. It's owning a professional sports team is one of the scarcest assets there is. Even if you're only a casual sports fan, you might say, oh, there's all these sports leagues, but I mean, there's a lot of billionaires in North America. What is there, 120 sports teams maybe to own at most? And these are pretty prized possessions if you're in a certain class of people. And so the value of NHL teams is gone through the roof. And to me, it's that's not actually a knock on the NHL. I just think it's where I see an example of money being broken, because if we charted it alongside the increase in M2 money supply, I think you'd see a similar kind of trend. I mean, it went a certain way for a number of years, sort of steady increase, and then it went up and to the right in a dramatic fashion. And so that would be one way I'd see it. Because of all the rules I mentioned about COVID, we haven't seen it with player salaries. But I think that it's fair to assume in a few years' time that it might follow the same way. And so money being broken, it's if you own a team or you're in the league's head office, you might say it's broken in your favor. But I do think it definitely fits what you're saying, because it's almost to a degree that it's hard to understand how something that was worth 400 million a few years ago is worth 2 billion today. I mean, but it's a prized asset, and inflation obviously dries up, scares resources even more.
Find that fascinating. That it never even occurred to me. You do hear of the Ryan Reynolds of the world going out and buying, I forget, is it Wexford or something like that, the soccer
Wrexham.
club? Yeah, Wrexham. And yeah, you hear other athletes that are at least interested, or not athletes, but actors and other entertainers. And you start to think like, okay, are they just a fan or is there more to it? And I mean, I've never thought of a sports team as an investment vehicle, but it absolutely is. Michael Jordan bought I guess they're the Bobcats or whatever they are nowadays, but he bought them for probably a couple 100 million, and then they're worth billions. Like it doesn't add up, right? The financials don't add up. It's not like the league makes that much more money. It literally is the dollar as this sort of broken system. And yeah, I find that really fascinating. It'll be interesting to see moving forward what other people get into it, and who's behind the scenes buying up these clubs that maybe we're not familiar with. Maybe they don't own it entirely, but at least they've got sort of a partial stake in it. So yeah, that's really fascinating. I never thought of it as a scarce asset, but it absolutely is. So
Yeah,
that's
and it's
so
just it's
weird.
because it's scarce asset. I haven't met you, Milan, in person, but I'm assuming it's not, when you're with your friends, it's not something that they're talking about investing in. But certainly at the very top ends of society, and if you went down the list of richest people, I mean, a lot of those people own either outright sports teams in North America, I'm speaking about, or own a piece of one somewhere. I mean, it's something that the way I would put it, the way that you and I might want to invest in real estate potentially, I think at a certain level, investing in a sports team is seen as a similar kind of investment with even a higher return than what we see in real estate.
Hmm. I know years ago the teachers pension plan, they own the Maple Leafs, or at least a part of. It kind of makes me wonder if more organizations are going to try to maybe get their hands on a sports franchise for that reason, because somebody in their investment fund that manages their portfolio will say, you know what, there's something to this. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you see that happening in the future?
For sure. I mean, I wish we could just short circuit that discussion and have them buy Bitcoin and put that on the balance sheet instead. I think that would be a more effective way to achieve the aims that they're looking for. But I mean, in seriousness, if you look at the valuation of sports franchises over time, again, I can speak to the North American professional sports, they haven't gone down. I mean, almost ever. As long as you can endure if you can operate the business, and some of those teams lose money on a yearly basis, but over time, owning that team is more than worth it. History has shown. I don't know if the kind of reckoning that might be coming to the wider world, how that will impact pro sports franchises. I mean, I can't imagine they're immune to it, but certainly it's been a good investment if you can play in that space. And I don't see anything to suggest it won't be. I mean, we've only in the NHL, the Ottawa Senators are just completing a sale right now, but beyond that, there aren't teams for sale. I mean, these are, again, scarce assets, and the people that hold them want to keep them, and it's hard to get into that club. And so I think the price is going to go up. I mean, the Seattle team paid $750 million for an expansion franchise, the most recent one in the NHL. There's talk that the next expansion price will be set at $2 billion, and that's potentially in a matter of years. And so, I mean, clearly these are pretty good investment vehicles for the people that are able to own them.
And even the arenas, when you look at the cost of building them, there was the football stadium in LA that it was in the billions. And if you go
Right.
back 10 years ago, you look at it and go like, there's no way it would cost that much money, but now it does. And you just imagine if let's say that Quebec gets another team and they opt to build a new stadium, whether it's funded privately or publicly, it's going to start costing people billions of dollars. And who knows how far that goes. It's
When I
expensive.
present this without comment, but a lot of the owners manage to get these buildings built in part or in whole with um, public funds. So I mean that also helps. If you're figuring out how you make money, that's a pretty good deal for the owner.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. I know over the past, I guess, couple of years, certainly within the last year, betting has become kind of a bigger part of well, pro sports in general, but certainly in the NHL. Have you noticed any sort of like transformation in the league because betting is becoming sort of this integral piece?
Well, you can't help but notice just the explosion of various ways that betting companies are interacting with the NHL through sort of what I'd call traditional sponsorships to, some have even managed to get to, a patch on team sweaters within arenas. Some of the arenas in the US have actual sports books now, small sports book built into them. I mean, from going back 10 years when any notion of sports betting being legalized, the NHL was staunchly against it. From the moment that the government's opened the doors, the league, basically did a complete 180, and since they couldn't fight it anymore, they decided to profit off it. And so, yeah, that's been quite noticeable, and I think it's probably driven in part some of the revenues that I said have bounced back in essence since COVID. It's become a new revenue stream for the league and for the teams individually. Even some of the players have individual sponsorships with some of the betting books. So it it hasn't really in the NHL dominated discussion in terms of morality. I mean, obviously players are not permitted in their contracts to bet on NHL games if they have an NHL contract. There hasn't been a case where, at least publicly, it's been known that that's happened. I know that's something that's cropped up in the NFL a little bit more, where they've had players get disciplined for being found to have bet on games. But from a business standpoint, it's been a huge boon for the league and the teams since that's been opened up.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not something that's going away anytime soon. As far as I'm concerned, if people are making more money off of it, it is here to stay. So, um, this being a Bitcoin show, we obviously got to get into Bitcoin. So, we've had players in the NFL for sure that have been open about owning Bitcoin, taking salaries in Bitcoin. So, are there any rumblings that you've heard of players, even whisperings, just talking about perhaps, let's say, taking their salary in Bitcoin, or even just talking about owning it with fellow teammates?
I know firsthand of about 5 players currently in the NHL that have been orange pilled that to some degree are investing in Bitcoin. I don't know of anyone personally taking their salary in it. I also know of some people that work for teams, um, you know, that are not only interested in Bitcoin, but trying to even encourage it a little bit in the dressing room culture that happens, introducing staff to it, the way we all might, try to share the idea or the learnings that we've had on this topic. But I don't, the one thing I've always, obviously, because I spend so much time thinking about hockey and I spend so much time thinking about Bitcoin, I've always wondered to what degree it's there. And, it's just impossible to know, what everyone's doing. I'm sure a lot of people invest quietly in lots of different things. And one kind of interesting thing that I have heard, believe it or not, is among foreigners that end up playing in Europe, it's definitely more of a very commonly discussed topic there. In fact, I know of one team that was in the KHL. This is before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so you had more Canadians and Americans and Swedes playing in the Russian-based league, which is the KHL. That it was a huge topic of conversation among the foreigners on this particular team, in part because they had the challenge of how do you get the money out of Russia, right? I mean, they're paid relatively large sums of money, and there could be difficulties crossing the border. And with some of the KHL teams, believe it or not, they get bonuses and things paid in a large sum of cash. And so there's sort of maybe more front and center money challenges that players in that circumstance find themselves in. And I do know of one team that had a number of players that started basically putting that money into Bitcoin, both to protect themselves in the future, but as an easier way to take money back perhaps to another jurisdiction without any friction in the middle, no middleman, of course. So I do think it's there, and there's an element, but it feels smaller than the other sports. I mean, when I hear someone as prominent as Saquon Barkley, go on Jack Mallers' podcast, Money Matters, and he's talking, really intimately, if you happen to catch that episode, talking about the ins and outs of his contract discussion, which I found fascinating, just because it's hard to get that level of detail from an athlete. And then talking about investing in Bitcoin and taking salary in Bitcoin, there's no one that yet in hockey circles that's at that level, at least publicly. But I mean, it's only a matter of time, right? I mean, I can't imagine it. It makes so much sense for everybody, but it makes even more sense if you're an athlete. I mean, what's the biggest thing we're all fighting against? We're fighting against the earning of the dollars that we earn today, but they're not going to be worth as much when we need them down the line, maybe when we don't have the same employment. I mean, that exactly covers what an athlete's biggest challenge is. You or I might think it's way too much money, but they make a lot of money today, but it's going to be worth less in 30 years when they may not have a job. And so I feel like athletes, once they understand this, or maybe their financial advisors, the people that they rely on for that kind of information, I think it's going to be a game changer once more NHL players, start actively putting their money into Bitcoin.
Is there much, how do I put this, dialogue, conversations that happen between players of different leagues? Like an NHL player hanging out, chatting, shooting the shit with somebody from the NBA, for example?
I think there might be a little bit of that, but it's definitely more within a team. I mean, there's certainly, keep in mind how much time a team spends together, right? You're
Right.
talking about 23 people that are getting paid anywhere from 200 grand to $1 million every 2 weeks during the season, that are on the road together 100 plus days a year on trains, planes, buses, and hotels, with lots of downtime, as demanding as their job is. And so I do think that certainly there's players that are very actively interested in all kinds of investments and share advice and share intel, maybe on, I use this person to handle my money. Maybe should, I think that there's a lot of that within the environment of the NHL. I think it's certainly some players would have those relationships outside beyond their league, but I think it's far more internal. And that's why I'm really looking forward to the day that I can see more of a light, that I know that it's taking hold, because I don't have that sense just yet. There's a player by the name of Peter Holland, played in the NHL. I actually ended up writing a story for him when I was still working at the Toronto Star about his transformation. But he basically walked away from a hockey career and started, basically selling Bitcoin. And, he was hoping to use his contacts, because, obviously among his peers are many current players, to basically impart his knowledge or try to get in their ears. And, I never followed up with Peter, and probably maybe he couldn't say because of privacy reasons how successful he was, but that's to me a reminder of starting to see that this is going to happen. And I just think it serves all of us well, but I think it really serves someone well who's going to earn a lot of money for a short period of time, but then still has a long life, hopefully, to live on the other side of those earning years.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's a really cool story. I had no idea. What do you think it's going to take for guys like us, or just other people out there, to really shed light and to educate people within the league to kind of open up and say, what, this Bitcoin thing, it's real, it's not going away. Maybe you need to take a closer look at it.
Well, I think a BlackRock ETF will help. We're going to see lots of money come in whenever the ETF spot funds are approved in the U.S., which just seems like it's a matter of some amount of time versus the question of whether it will happen. I think that will free up a lot of different. We're focused, rightfully so, on big institutions, but I think even people that might have be investing the amount of money an NHL player would be looking to invest. It just makes it easier for their advisors to do that. I think something like that will be huge for athletes. And, really, when I look at it, I don't know that it's anything more than time, unfortunately. I mean, people tend to find Bitcoin, it seems, when they're supposed to, when they finally open their mind to it, or they've heard about it enough, or maybe something clicks for them. But, no one can be forced to do it. And there's a pretty high barrier of entry, I think. I mean, it took me hearing about it a few times before I took it seriously. And then once I took it seriously, I almost want to go so far to say it changed my life. It changed my outlook for sure on a lot of different things. And so, I think it's just going to take more time and adoption to grow and to become more mainstream. And obviously, I mean, the kind of money these guys are able to be investing, I think that they're relying on big money managers essentially to start adopting this. And I think that'll be made much easier once we have ETFs in the US.
Yeah, I agree with that. You wonder how much of the let's say investment side of it that gets put into an ETF, how much that gets translated into players actually understanding what the money is really going into? Like for anybody that
Right.
doesn't know, if, or I guess I shouldn't say if, when the spot ETF gets approved, um, anybody that is buying a share of it, they're not holding Bitcoin outright. They're essentially getting sort of a derivative to it. So I just wonder how much of that sort of educational piece will be there. Where if I'm an NHL player that knows my investment managers put money into the spot ETF, do I even realize sort of what my money is doing, if you will, or will they even care? Like at the end of the day, do the players are they simply looking for a return on their investment, or do they actually care and want to understand sort of where their money's going, what it's doing? What do you think?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think there's obviously a range there, and certainly I know some players that are very dialed into business and would be probably really actively managing their money and knowing what it's for and why decisions are made. But my sort of instincts tell me probably the majority or the higher percentage are just sort of trusting that the person they have managing their money knows what he or she are doing, and they put faith in that. And I realize that's dangerous, but look, this is, again, we're talking about largely people in their 20s, who don't, it's hard in your 20s when you're super fit professional athlete playing in front of millions of people making lots of money to even imagine a day when life's going to look what it's going to look like perhaps in their 50s. And on top of that, I just think that they have to put so much into their career on a daily basis that they just, a lot is done in an athlete's life to eliminate distractions, whether that's with the media, whether that's, maybe if friends or family are asking for a lot. Usually there's almost a go between in terms of, say, managing tickets being given out. I mean, a lot has to go into performance. And so I don't think it would be a particularly high number of players that are really actively into it. But that being said, I have known lots of guys over the years say that moved around from team to team and would tell me about all the real estate they held. When they got traded, they would start renting their house to someone else. And there are a number of players that are into the more financial aspects. And so, I think ultimately, I don't know that we're going to get to a point though where everyone understands what Bitcoiners feel the mission is, and that the money is broken. My personal view is, and it's hard to measure this, when we get things like ETFs, I don't know if the average person really that starts investing in them is going to. I mean, I think, part of Bitcoin might just be, I can't tell you how the internet works, but I've been on the internet every day for the last 25 years. I mean, there might just be a certain amount of people that just operate in it over time here, but don't take the time to try to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And so, I just don't know that a lot of players are going to spend that amount of time and effort and energy to figure it all out.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, people that aren't even in professional sports, one thing they always say is, "I don't have time." Right? I'm too busy looking after the kids, or I'm too busy working. So, how many people really want to take the time to learn what Bitcoin is, let alone just investing more broadly? Um, and yeah, I mean, most of the things that I use, I probably don't know how they operate either. But I can proudly say that I've taken the time, many, many hours to learn about Bitcoin, because for me, I understand that money's broken, and I understand that it's important to understand why it's broken, what's the alternative. And, both of us come to the same conclusion, like Bitcoin is the answer. We don't know how quickly this thing's going to sort of pan out, but certainly a spot ETF will help in um, raising the number of the value, the price. Um, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what players do, how they respond, and how the league responds. Because who knows what if it hits 100,000 US at some point? Is there all of a sudden this sort of inflection point where the league embraces it and other leagues embrace it? And if so, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're at the concession stand and all of a sudden you have the option of using Visa or Bitcoin? It's an interesting future that's sort of coming. We just don't know when it's coming.
It can't be that far off, though. When you look at, even, I know Peter McCormack's got his Bitcoin team in soccer that's way down the league, but you can go right now into an English soccer game and pay with Bitcoin. I think that there's a lot of copycat sort of things that happen across pro sports, and it's the light switch is going to go on somewhere. And quite honestly, I love what I do. The only thing I would ever think about changing careers by my choice would be if I could be involved in a team that was getting into Bitcoin. Like I think that would be super cool to be on the front edge of kind of the marriage of these two things that dominate so much of my life. And so I do believe it's inevitable and probably in this next halving, honestly. Like I think I try to put my head to like what's 24 and 2025 going to feel like
Mhm.
if Bitcoin does the things I would expect it to do and what it's sort of done historically. If you look at the trends, I mean, I just think it's going to take a major leap forward in the public consciousness, and it's probably going to start touching all areas of our lives in ways that we can't even fully, wrap our minds around today.
I had somebody online say something to a similar degree where he said like 2024 might be Bitcoin's most important year, obviously not including the genesis of Bitcoin itself. But I think you put that really well. It's like all of a sudden, if the price reaches a certain number, so many people wake up to it. And I think that's where the ETF is important because it legitimizes it for people, especially those more conservative investors, because they're like, holy crap, this thing that's not going away. You've got the biggest money managers in the world that are saying, "Yep, this is important." What was that? What was it? Not Fidelity. It was BlackRock that said they should put about 80 to 85% of their portfolio into Bitcoin. Like
Right.
that's insane, and that cannot be ignored. Of course, mainstream media is not really going to talk about that. They're not going to highlight that, but we're going to come to a point, and hopefully in the near future, where everybody is sort of forced to wake up and whether or not they go down the rabbit hole and they learn what it is, probably not going to happen. But I think what will happen is that people will start buying, and there will be, let's say a small percentage of people that'll go, okay, I own a little bit of Bitcoin. What the heck am I actually owning? Because I think that's what most of us have done. Like we bought it, we probably traded it for some shit coins, got burned along the way, and we said, okay, if I'm going to own this, I'd better learn something about it. And then it just leads you into this trajectory of like learning about energy, learning about philosophy, and that's just the cool thing about Bitcoin. It touches everything.
Yeah, and the part that I've come to really appreciate lately too is just the idea that you're responsible for yourself in a sense,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it really, and that could be scary depending on how you think about that. Um, but it can also be kind of liberating, and I just thinking about how you plan, how you secure it, how do you communicate to your loved ones in case something were to happen to you, all this sort of stuff. I mean, there's just a lot more onus put on you. It's where it's not there's no helpline if something goes wrong, right? I mean, that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately, and it's just I find that I actually think there's something beautiful in that. I think if we put that sort of idea in our mind every day, we'd probably sometimes do some things differently. But ultimately, we're responsible for ourselves, or obviously, if you have kids or whatever, your family members. But I just love how it kind of it gets rid of all the bullshit. Frankly, I think that and for me, it's been a huge amount of hope. Quite honestly, Milan. Just I think I would not be at the kind of peace I feel today if I hadn't have discovered it and understood it. And literally every single day, I'm listening to some podcast. That's how I ended up stumbling on your podcast, and just lean on this community of people, most of whom I haven't met. I have a very small face-to-face Bitcoin community, but I feel like I know everybody out there because I've listened to them speak so many places, and they've been so important in ways they probably can't understand, and just helping me find my way through this world.
So, what was the driving force that got you into it?
The lockdowns in COVID time really, I think, first of all, just stopping, right? I
Mhm.
mean, at that point in time, my life looks different than it looks today. I was traveling a ton, probably 150 days a year, going to NHL games or NHL events. So it's sort of I was on a treadmill. Or I was just constantly in a race to get to the next race, to get to the next race. And so the whole notion of games being stopped, where I had to consider what happens if I lose my job. I mean, if there's no games, I can't really fault an employer if they don't want to employ someone whose primary job is to talk about the NHL when there's no NHL. So that gave me a chance to reflect and think. I think a lot of people probably went in all sorts of directions, but something never felt right to me about what the stock market was doing. How were we just handing money out to everyone? Like I can't pretend that I have this advanced level of understanding, but I've always been interested in how things work, and really I had like a strange interest in money going back to when I was a young child. Like I've basically had a job since I was 8 years old continuously. I just did all sorts of stuff from paper boy to hockey referee to, when I got into high school, I could work at Wendy's. And I've always liked to think about money and how it works. I've never had really relative. I mean, I know we're very fortunate to live in this part of the world, but I've never been rich or anything per se in the way we might measure that typically. But I just always like thinking about how it works and obviously trying to find some comfort in my life in terms of investing smartly. And it just ultimately led me to finally, I think, take a real look at Bitcoin. And I think a lot of people have this story. I've got a friend from high school who was telling me about it in 2013. I remember going over to his apartment back then, probably just to have a beer and chat with him. And he had a little miner set up in his apartment. He was showing me how it works, and I just was like, "What is this thing? Like, these are numbers on a screen. Like, what are you doing?" And
Right.
completely dismissed it, frankly. And it's funny, that friend ended up owning what would be today worth a lot of Bitcoin. Unfortunately, ended up losing them when Mount Gox went down. And he's still in I think a lawsuit there to try to recover some of those coins. But I really didn't give it much thought in the 7 years in the middle. And then all of a sudden, 2020, the light went on, and I had lots of time, and I've really never looked back. From the time I took the orange pill in 2020, and it's been, I would say, almost an obsession ever since.
That sounds oddly familiar. I mean, that's the same thing happened to me. And a big part of it for me was the stock market, looking at it, knowing that businesses are shutting down, people are staying at home, they're not going to work, and yet asset prices, obviously not including the big drop we saw, but shortly thereafter, just the huge swings, just seeing things skyrocket. And I'm talking to my father-in-law going like, look at these charts, like something doesn't add up. And at the time, I had no idea about the Cantillon effect, knew nothing about it. Um, I bought a bit of Bitcoin, and then I started learning, and then just one thing after another kind of just opened my eyes. And once you open your eyes to it, like it cannot be unseen, and you just want to keep learning. And that's what this show is. It's just learning opportunity after learning opportunity for me, and hopefully for the people watching and listening. My hope is every day you take something away from the show. I'm certainly going to take some things away from this one. I found it fascinating. If people want to, find you, learn more about you, where can they look?
X is probably the best place. Reporter Chris is where I hang out there. I have the same handle on Instagram, but I'm nowhere near as interesting as the Instagram influencers. It's more just for friends and family largely. But yeah, and then my work appears on TSN professionally, and hopefully if you're based somewhere in the GTA, I'll see you at a Bitcoin event sometime in the future. I try to interact there, and I do as time goes along. I really want to explore more of that world. And yeah, I mean, it's I can't unsee it now, Milan. So I'm looking to get more and more involved as time goes on.
Well, you're obviously a bright man, and you are obviously in touch with Bitcoin. Like you understand what it is, you understand the relevance, what it's capable of. You know the nomenclature, which a lot of people outside of Bitcoin don't. So you fit really well within the community. And personally, I haven't really had a chance to meet people in person as much as I'd like to. Moving forward, hopefully that changes. But I could tell you, like people in this community are all amazing. Everybody's super down to earth and friendly. So just as I'm embracing you, I'm sure other people will too. So thanks again for your time, and this was awesome. Love to have you back on sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And I'm merely a pleb, so thanks for giving me a bit of a platform in an area where I'm still just learning my way too.
Love it, man. Take care.